Gouache paint. What is it? Why am I struggling to use it? How do you actually pronounce it? Guys, today we're gonna dive right into it and I'm gonna be answering all of your questions about gouache paint, why you're struggling to use it, and also provide you all of my most helpful tips and tricks that I've learned about using gouache paint over the years. So I've just looked up how to pronounce gouache paint on Google, and as you can see here, it sounds like Gooaash. What does she sound like?
Gouache.
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 Okay, gouache, I guess is how you actually say it. Gouache. I'm going to continue to say gouache. I think that sounds very similar to gouache. And you know what? I also want to let you guys know that I did look into like the history of the word as well. Gouache, not the history of the word gouache, but the history of gouache painting, because I really wanted to give you guys some sort of, actually informative information on the topic as well. So when you just do a little Google search of the history of gouache painting, it says that it came about in the 16th century after artists applied oil paint over tempera to achieve a matte finish. Gouache, an opaque watercolor painting medium, has a history dating back to ancient times. While the term gouache itself emerged in 18th century France, that makes a lot of sense by how the way that it's actually pronounced the word, now that I know that it came from France. Okay. The technique of using opaque watercolors with binding agents like gum arabic can be traced to ancient Egypt and Greece. So that's actually very good information to know, that it traces back to ancient Egypt with binding agents like gum arabic. Because now that we know how to pronounce gouache, let's actually look into what makes gouache different from acrylic paint and even watercolor paint. Now, I had to do a little bit of research myself because I honestly did not know what chemically differentiated acrylic paint, gouache paint, watercolor paint. But through doing a little bit of research on Google, this is what I found. For watercolor paint, the pigments are ground into an extremely fine powder. So for watercolor paint, this extremely fine pigment is then mixed with gum arabic, which we just learned traces back to ancient Egypt and Greece. And gum arabic basically is just a binding agent. That is the binding agent that is actually used in the paint. So it binds the pigments to the paper, to all of the other things that you're using when you're using the paint. So then what's different about watercolor and gouache paint? Well, the pigments for gouache paint are not ground up quite as fine as for watercolor paint. Therefore, the pigments are larger in the gouache paint, which results in a heavier pigment load versus watercolor paint. Now, another key thing to actually take from this information is the binding agents itself. The gum arabic binding agent is actually what allows the watercolor and gouache paint to be water soluble. What that means is, say you've already started a watercolor or gouache painting, you have it on your paper, but it's dry. You could literally re-wet your brush and start painting it again, and it'll reabsorb that water and you can use it again and keep creating on that same painting with the paint that you've already put on. And in doing this research, it actually made so much sense to me, because whenever I'm explaining gouache to other artists, other people at markets and events, I always describe it as being much more highly pigmented than watercolor. That's always something that I have noticed immediately about using gouache paint. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So now, we have to differentiate acrylic paint from watercolor and gouache. The thing that makes acrylic paint different is that the binder that's used in acrylic paint is a polymer binder, which is basically plastic. Whereas we explained with watercolor and gouache, it's a gum arabic binder. That is actually what makes the difference between acrylic, gouache, and watercolor paint, is the binders that are inside the paint. And the difference between a polymer binder and a gum arabic binder is that the polymer binder dries permanently. So the conclusion from that little chemistry lesson there is that gouache paint and watercolor paint use gum arabic binders and acrylic paint use polymer binders. That is what makes the difference between acrylic paint and watercolor and gouache paint. But guys, there is much more to get into here, because this put me down another rabbit hole. because I realized that the paint that I use, the gouache paint that I use, is called Acryla gouache paint. I use the Holbein Acryla gouache paint. So in my brain, I'm like, this has to be different just from the name itself. And I realized that there is a difference between acrylic gouache and regular gouache. So it does get a little bit more technical than, what I realized myself. So then I did a little bit of research about the specific paint that I use, my Holbein acrylic gouache, because I needed to know if this was different than regular gouache, if it was the same, because I've used normal gouache and then I've also used acrylic gouache. I'm like, is it different? Is it the same? It is different. So what I realized is that the acrylic gouache or acrylic gouache from Holbein, it uses a acrylic resin as the binder. So it's therefore more similar to actually acrylic paint than the gouache paints that use a gum arabic binder. And I just thought that it was important that I add that part because I didn't want to mislead anybody, because I do have many painting processes on my channel where I do gouache paint, but I only use my Holbein acrylic gouache paint at this time. So I just wanted to point out that that specific gouache does use a binder that's more similar to acrylic paint versus regular gouache paint. So now that you have all that technical information about gouache paint, acrylic paint, you're probably thinking to yourself, Miranda, knowing all that technical information is great, but does not actually help me when it comes to creating a gouache painting. So now we're going to transition into the part of the video where I'm actually going to provide you guys my real life experience, tips, helpful tricks that I've learned from using various types of gouache paint and actually building up the skill over a couple of years. Because I can confidently say, you guys, okay? I can confidently say, I'm going to share photos, okay? I'm going to share a photo of you. I'm going to share a photo with you of my first ever gouache painting that I did versus a more recent gouache painting. So I can confidently say that I do have some experience and that I do feel like I can give you some tips that will actually help you, because I kind of went from this to being able to create something a little bit better. The first thing to know about gouache paint that is essential, it is literally the first thing that I talk to anybody about when they ask me about gouache paint, is that it dries extremely quickly. When I say quickly, in a couple minutes, that layer is going to be dry. Like, that is going to be dry. So it is very much a layering process. I always recommend that you have a spray bottle with you that has some water in it so you can spray your paints as you're going, as well as like a Sta-Wet palette of some kind. I use one in most of my videos. I'll link it below, but any kind of like palette with a lid would be great to keep your paints from not drying out. But for my paintings personally, I like to start my first layers extremely diluted with a lot of water. And then as I'm slowly creating and building the layers of my painting, I will dilute it less and less. And then the last layers of my painting are the most opaque, thick, saturated version of the gouache paint. And it's important to remember that if you don't allow this, if you don't allow the paint to dry in layers, you will end up with a muddy mess. Your paper will most likely lift and disintegrate. It has happened to me when I was first learning. So really make sure to let those layers dry. My second tip is to get the proper surface that you want to use for your gouache paint. And what I mean by that is to get the proper type of paper or canvas that will best adhere to the gouache paint and will best accept that paint on the surface. Back when I first started using gouache paint, I was using a very specific sketchbook. It was the Strathmore Mixed Media sketchbook. If any of you guys know, it's like the ones with the yellow covers, but that was the one that I used because like I didn't know much. I thought mixed media, you can use it for whatever. And I mean, it is an option. You can use it, but that was the type of paper where it would literally disintegrate. Like, it was causing me some issues. So then I started kind of experimenting more, and what I use now is Arches watercolor paper. And you don't need to use that brand specifically, but just remember that when it comes to paper for gouache paint, you want to use 100% cotton. That is going to be the best when it comes to using paper. But you can also use like a regular cotton canvas or even a wooden canvas. It might be best though to gesso those before you put your gouache paint on. Especially with wood canvases, they tend to absorb the paint a little bit more. And if you're not used to that, it might throw you off a bit. So just make sure to use gesso before using gouache paint on any surface that is not paper. My next tip kind of ties into the last one, which is just to make sure that you have the proper brushes as well to be using with gouache paint. If you're a watercolor artist, you probably already have some brushes in your kit that are going to be very useful for gouache paint. It's important to remember that synthetic haired brushes are the best when it comes to using gouache or even watercolor paint. This is because the synthetic bristles don't absorb the pigment as much as, let's say, they would if you were using another brush. Like if you're using a natural haired brush with your gouache paint, it's not going to apply or look as good on the paper as well. I think another reason why synthetic brushes are important is because gouache paint, watercolor paint is very delicate. Paints like acrylic and oil can be very textured, very thick, so the natural bristles are perfect for that. But with this delicate gouache paint, especially when you're using different layers, diluting it with the water, you really need a soft synthetic bristle to really do the job right. My favorite brushes to use, and I will be honest with you guys, they're the only brushes that I use for my gouache paints. I have been using them for years. When I started them, I haven't stopped using them. They're amazing. I love the Princeton Aqua Elite brushes. They are awesome to use for either watercolor or gouache, and I have several different types of brushes from that brush set. So those are the ones that I use. Again, they are synthetic brushes, so they're perfect for gouache paint. If you're somebody who is struggling to use gouache paint, or you've never even tried it and you're just intimidated, just remember that we all start from somewhere. Remember the paintings that I showed you earlier of my first gouache painting versus where I'm at now. Like that first one was by no means a masterpiece, but I just kept going. I didn't give up. I just genuinely was interested in creating that skill. And if you want to master the skill of gouache, that is something that is completely capable of you to do. This video was just kind of beginner tips and tricks and advice that I've learned, like I said. But if you're somebody that maybe has used gouache paint and you want more in-depth, maybe more intermediate, detailed examples of things that would be helpful, like blending, let me know below and I will do what I can to try to make a video that would be informative for other kinds of gouache information like that. I'll have all of my favorite gouache products listed down below so that if you guys want to check them out, you can and see different types of products that are available to you to try. But I would really recommend that if you're new or even if you've used gouache paint, just try different products. You're not going to know if something is right for you unless you try different products. I have gone through several different brands of gouache paint, several different brushes, and different surfaces to use on gouache paint over the years. And now I finally fine-tuned to where I found the products that I like to use. But don't be afraid to try new things and don't be afraid to just go out there and try using gouache paint. The one thing that I have found, and this is the reason why I wanted to make this video, is that people genuinely seem like scared and intimidated to try using gouache paint. And I don't want people to feel like that. It is not scary, it's not intimidating, and you just got to go for it. But just remember to have fun with it. That's what this is about. But that's all of my advice, all of my tips and tricks and information that I have on gouache paint for this video. But as I mentioned, if you guys are wanting to see another video about this gouache paint because this was helpful and informative to you, let me know down below and I will work on making that happen for you. But until next time, you guys, I will see you in the next video. Bye, guys.